This hag face kept flitting through his mind, but it did, over and over again. He took a second drink of liquor, hoping the stuff would rinse his brain, help him to think more clearly. Then he walked for a while, looking at the street signs, but giving no real thought to the direction he was taking. At midnight, he found himself in another saloon, a great warehouse-sized place called Everett's on Broadway near 40th Street. A TV set and a jukebox braying at one another like electronic lunatics bounced their noises off the gritty tiled floor and against the high tin ceiling of the place, setting up an ungodly racket. But none of the 20 or more customers at the bar appeared to notice. Joe swallowed 2 more straight shots of rye, chasing them down with beer, and then he lit a cigarette and cast his eyes about in search of a mirror in which he might begin to see something that made sense to him. Juanita, barefoot, had by this time moved into his mind on what seemed to be a permanent basis. She squatted there, gesturing at him like a devil, chairing a meeting in hell. He could see her mouth going, could hear even the sound of her voice, but the words themselves were indistinct. He found a small mirror on the cigarette machine, and buying an unneeded package of Camels, he looked into his weary eyes, thinking still of Juanita. She was the one put this entire goddamn New York notion in his head in the first place, so if she had any advice to pass out, he had to have some advice. That was all there was to it. The thought became an obsession. He wouldn't do another thing in this town until he'd found someone who knew the ropes and could give him some guidance. Returning to the bar in this new frame of mind, Joe found he was being looked at by a person who had arrived in his absence. This was a skinny, child-sized man of about 21 or 22 had taken the seat next to him. Catching Joe's attention, he grinned and made a small wave of the hand. "Excuse me for starting," he said in a New York accent. "I was just admiring that colossal shape." His head bobbed in approval. "Yeah, that is one hell of a shape. I'll bet you paid a pretty price for it. Am I right?" He spoke in a gravelly whisper, in which Joe heard a definite note of conspiracy. Without even considering the matter, he was certain this kind of speech went hand in hand with a knowledge of the underworld. "Oh, it ain't cheap," Joe said modestly, but put his fists on his hips and looked down, appraising himself. "I mean, yeah, I'd say this was an all-right shirt. Don't like to, have a lot of cheap stuff on my back, right?" Suddenly Joe knew exactly where he would get the advice he needed. He thrust his hand forward, saying, "Joe Buck from Houston, Texas. Gonna buy you a drink. What do you say to that?" They shook hands. The dirty, curly-haired little blonde runt introduced himself as Rico Rizzo of the Bronx. He had an air about him that suggested a knowledge of everything worth knowing, and he knew how to listen. His big brown eyes were tough and wise and sympathetic, and he had big ears that stuck straight out as if invisible hands were cupped behind them for maximum hearing power. of some childhood disease. His entire body dipped to the side with each step, so that his walk had a kind of rolling motion to it, like the progress of a lopsided wheel. The second thing Joe noticed was that the big ears sticking out of Rizzo's head did not seem at all to be the property of a man. Suddenly, the runt was a 12-year-old, and Joe had had to restrain an impulse to reach out and tweak an ear or tug on a handful of that filthy hair. As they sat down at a booth next to the blaring jukebox, Joe watched Rizzo take his left leg in both hands and lift it into place under the table. His teeth were clenched, and his face were pale with the effort. For Joe, this was a precarious moment. The awareness that his new friend was in pain, probably lived in a constant state of pain, threatened to wreck entirely this brilliant hour they'd been having. Liquor had given Joe special seeing powers, and he saw now a truth about life, heretofore hidden from him, that always, in even the finest hour, there lurked this potential sudden ugliness. You could be going along just great with somebody, and a new piece of information would turn everything blue and sad. This, and the knowledge that there was nothing he could do to right the bad leg, induced in Joe an anger that was fierce. So fierce, he was unable to maintain for long his focus upon the object of it. And there he was with all this fury, and no one to throw it at, when suddenly his eye happened to catch hold of the jukebox. He began to shout obscene names at the noises it made, and he saw in his mind's eye a quick movie of a tall cowboy kicking hell out of all those colored lights. He rose on his way to bringing this image into reality, when something in Rizzo's face stopped him. Surprise and a flicker of fear. Joe smiled a kind of puzzled apology and went to the men's room. On the way, he realized the liquor was having some undesirable side effects: nausea, dizziness. He had to hurry to the toilet in order not to be sick on the floor. Later, at the sink, he rinsed his mouth out and gave himself a talking to out loud in the mirror, surprised to hear coming from himself the voice of Juanita Barefoot, much deeper than his own. "Let's cool them drinks, cowboy. They's work to do." "Shut up, old witch. I know what I'm doing," he said, trying hard to sound like himself. Returning to the table, he said, "I believe I've about had enough of that liquor." "Yeah." Rizzo, filled with some other thought, was nodding and looking at Joe through narrowed eyes. "I got this thing figured out now," he said, pulling each word past the bed of gravel in his throat. "You're in luck, Joe. Give me a cigarette." Joe quickly handed him a Camel and lighted it for him, feeling that he was about to experience an important moment. He took one for himself, sucked deep on it, and leaned forward. Rizzo let out a cloud of smoke. Then he did some more nodding, looking always at Joe Buck. He said it 3 or 4 times, each time seeing Joe's face in some new way. "What you need," he said at last, "is Mr. O'Daniel." At this point, the jukebox set forth on some new rampage, and Joe missed entirely the name of the thing he needed. Rizzo was busy removing a piece of tobacco from his tongue and studying it, caught between his thumb and forefinger. Joe grabbed him by the wrist. "I need what? I need what?" he shouted. "Mr. O'Daniel," Rizzo repeated. "Mr. O'Who?" "Mr. O'Daniel." "Talk louder." "Management," Rizzo shouted. "You need management. You know what management is." "I'm listening." "Okay, now look." Rizzo leaned forward, and somehow, miraculously, Joe was able to hear every word he said. "With these chicks, the ones that want to buy it, most of them are old or rich, and they're very dignified, social register types. Follow me?" They can't be seen trotting down to Times Square picking out the merchandise. Don't that make sense? They got to have a middleman, an agent, a representative. You with me, Joe? Yeah. Joe nodded vigorously, putting his head in position again, the ear near Rizzo's mouth. So, all right, Rizzo concluded. Mr. O'Daniel is the guy. He threw his hands into the air, palms up. That's it. Joe felt all his muscles relax. He rested against the back of the booth. The seat was hard, but it felt like down. He shook his head, smiled, and said, "Shit." Then he laughed happily. "Matter of fact," Rizzo said, "I placed a fellow with him about 2 weeks ago. He's doing fabulous today. Lots of new clothes. Drives a car. Goes to the bank every goddamn day of his life to make deposits naturally. And far as I know, he's not much of a stud either. Just a very ordinary guy." Joe sat forward again. "I wish to hell I'd bumped into you this afternoon. Yeah, it's a shame a guy like you passing out $20 bills to fat ladies. It's crazy. Not that I blame you. Christ, I'm just as bad as you. Worse, a woman cries around me. I give her anything she wants. One tear, I start carving my heart right out of my chest for her. I call that," said a new voice, "a very minor operation." The 2 young men they'd seen entering the place earlier were standing next to the booth. The taller of the 2 was the speaker, a shiny-faced, blue-eyed boy who looked as if he might be a farmer, but his eyebrows had been plucked into a careful, narrow line, confusing that initial impression. "Cutting that little thing out of you," he said, "would be no more serious than lancing of oil." Rizzo said, "Let's get out of here, Joe." But he made no move to go because the young men were blocking his way. "In fact," the tall boy continued, "just sit comfy there, and I'll do it right here with my fingernail file. You won't even need to use your Blue Cross. What do you think of that plan, Rizzo?" "The name is Rizzo." "That's what I said. Rizzo." At this point, Joe Buck got to his feet. His movements had in them a slow mixture of menace and benevolence he'd learned from Western movies. "Hey," he said, smiling at the tall young man in a way that said, "I'm not a real killer, but then again, if I'm pressed." Both boys looked at him with considerable respect. And Joe Buck simply shook his head back and forth, slowly, magnificently, suggesting an immediate cessation of all hostilities. Rizzo said, "That's okay, Joe. I'm used to these types. Pick on cripples. The sewers are full of them." "Excuse me," said the farmer-looking boy, addressing himself with great politeness to the cowboy. "May I ask one thing?" Joe lowered his eyelids in a slow, strong assent. "It's just this. If you sit over here, and he," pointing at Rizzo, "sits way over there, how's he going to get his hand into your pocket?" "Oh, well," he shrugged, dismissing the subject. "I'm sure he's got that all figured out." He turned to Rizzo. "Good night, sweets." The 2 young men left the place. Rizzo looked at Joe with his eyes wide open, a sober expression on his face. "Well," he said, "now I suppose you think I'm dishonest." Before Joe could answer, Rizzo continued, "Well, I am. So if you want to cut out on me, it's a free country." "Hell," Joe said immediately, "I ain't going nowhere. I don't walk out on a buddy just 'cause I find out he's got some little bitty teensy something wrong." Now, Joe so And what I got to do, I got to get hold of them ropes. Get out of this pickle I'm in. Rizzo relaxed a little. He licked his lips quickly and said, I suppose that's a sensible way to look at it. Joe leaned across the table. Will you take me to this bird right now? This Mr. Oh, who's it? Now. Rizzo showed surprise. This time of night. He frowned, seeming to turn the question over in his mind. Well, I suppose I could, but he looked at Joe, directly challenging him. Look, you tell me why I should. 'Cause you're a nice guy. 'Cause you bought me drinks. Well, that's great. But you know how long it's apt to take me to find this bum. First I'll have to walk a lot, and with this gimp, it takes time, and it's no picnic. Meanwhile, I'm not doing myself any good. I'm tired. My pocket's not getting any fuller. You with me there? And tomorrow, while you're laying up in some Fifth Avenue townhouse, getting your back scratched by some rich broad who knows where Ritzel will be. The automat, probably. Hey now. Joe was indignant. You hold it. You just hold it right there. You think I'm that kind son of a bitch? Is gonna take everything I make and keep it? You think I'm not gonna let you have a piece of it? Why, shit. You talk like a man with a tin ass. Joe waved his hand in the air between them, as if to dispel all this nonsense at once. Thanks, Joe, said Rizzo. I said you were a nice guy, and you just proved it. But, he shook his head. I don't do nothing on spec. It's a matter of principle. You understand? I didn't say nothing about no spec, Joe declared flatly. I said I was gonna give you a piece, so you just name what cut you want. No, Joe. What I mean is, I don't trust nobody to give me nothing later. No offense. You look like an honest guy. You got an honest face. But so have I, right? Have I got an honest face? Hell yeah, you got an honest face. There. Rizzo snapped his finger and pointed at Joe's nose. You proved my point. I got an honest face, but I'm crooked as hell. So why should I trust you? Can you answer me that? Joe thought for a moment, frowning with the effort. He put out his cigarette and reached into his hip pocket. I'll give you something now. Right this goddamn minute. Oh, wait a minute, Joe, Rizzo said. Use your head. He put on a sad, pained look, as if what he was about to say caused him great agony. Shaking his head, he spoke in a high, small voice. You shouldn't be trusting me. Don't you see? With this, he made himself very small and looked up into Joe's face with his eyes so wide open and lids looked like they might tear at the edges. It would be so easy to clip you, he said. Oh, well, you think I'm worried about that? Joe waved the thought away. Then he spread his money out on the table. What do you suppose would be a fair amount? Rizzo leaned in, ready to do business. I leave it up to you, Joe. Well, let's be hard-ass about the thing and figure it out, right? When am I apt to clear from a night with one of these rich ladies? A night? Did you say a night, baby? Rizzo said. Mr. O'Daniel, don't bother booking no one-night stands. What he's gonna find you, he's gonna find you a position for Christ's sake. Now, the first dame may or may not work out permanent. Who knows? Maybe the second one won't, or even the third. For a permanent setup, you got to hit it off just right. But the audition alone is gonna net you 50, 100, maybe more. That's just for the goddamn audition. Audition? The trial run, the trial night. Joe was impressed. 50 or $100. He tapped the table where his money was. Here, how much you want? 10. Rizzo made a deprecating little laugh. I'm easy. Listen, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take the 10. He stuck the bill into his pocket, handling it as if it were a thing of no value whatever. But when I hand you over to Mr. O'Daniel, I'll have to have another 10. Is that fair? There was a pause. All right. If it's not fair, forget it. Answer me something, Joe said. What's the chances of this bird putting me to work tonight? Chances? It's got nothing to do with chances. You will be working tonight. Fact. That's it. Period. You just don't understand New York, Joe. You don't grasp the situation we got here. You know this expression, a seller's market. Joe shook his head. It means like the demand is far greater than the supply. You get that? Joe frowned. Well, let me put it this way. There's more women than studs, so you can have all the work you want. Joe was on his feet at once. Seven. Walking up Broadway toward Times Square, Joe observed that Rizzo's leg served him well enough in an open stretch. He would catch hold of a certain target with his eye, the next corner, say, and then set himself in motion, falling at once into a kind of crazy wheel rhythm that rolled him toward his objective. At such a hell-bent pace, one wondered if he'd be able to stop himself at the traffic light. At 42nd Street, Rizzo said, We'll try this hotel first. With fantastic luck, we'll find him in his room. Come on. They wove their way through the traffic of people whose complexions appeared never to have seen the real sun, only this topsy-turvy daylight of neon and electricity, a kind of light that penetrated the first layer of skin, even cosmetics, illuminating only the troubled colors under the surface. Wary blue, sick green, narcotic gray, sleepless white, dead purple. Not that you'll be there, Rizzo mumbled. What I expect I'll have to drag his leg in and out of every bar in the West 40s, and frankly, I don't know why I bother. I don't need a buck that bad. As they entered the lobby of the Times Square Palace Hotel, Joe said, Shit, man, this is where I live. Rizzo brought himself to a halt. He looked at Joe carefully. You live here, he said in a small, high voice. Joe nodded. Yeah. Do you know anybody else that lives here, by any chance? I don't guess. I only checked in today. You sure? Hell yeah, I'm sure. Well, what do you know? Rizzo's smile was weak. Coincidence, huh? He picked up the house phone. Mr. O'Daniel, please. I want to talk to Mr. O'Daniel. During the pause, he winked at Joe, showing him a circle formed by his forefinger and thumb. Mr. O'Daniel, how do you do, sir? This is Enrico Rizzo speaking. Oh, but I remember you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, many times. He was unforgettable. Mr. O'Daniel, I've got a young man here, a very fine young cowboy, and he's ready to, well, frankly, sir, he's just in from the West, and he needs your help. Needs it bad. You think you could work out something for him tonight? I've never seen anybody so. I was gonna say he's anxious to get started. Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, sir. If you could, He held his hand over the mouthpiece and whispered to Joe, He's dying to get you started tonight. I guess he's up to here with orders and nobody to send. You sure you want to? Joe nodded with such vigor that the entire upper half of his body was used in the gesture. Into the telephone, Rizzo said, Yes, sir. 317. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Rizzo hung up the telephone. He's very excited to meet you already. Well, what'll I do? Just go on up. Room 3:17. Let's see how you look. Rizzo stepped back, appraising Joe from head to foot. Fine, you look fine. Now, I'm gonna have to have that other 10. Right? Listen, kid. Joe handed Rizzo a $10 bill. Then he took hold of his arm with both hands, one at the wrist, one at the elbow. I want you to know I appreciate this. And furthermore, when things work out well, I won't forget you. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. And I mean it. Nah, you don't owe me a thing. Look, I'm glad to help already. With a flick of the finger, the money disappeared into Rizzo's side pocket. No, Joe insisted. I want to know where I can find you. 'Cause, damn it, I'm gonna make this thing right with you. Now, what's your address? Come on, quit it, will you? I want your address, Joe insisted. All right, I'm at the Sherry Netherland Hotel. Now get your ass up there. He's waiting. Joe released Rizzo's arm. He closed his eyes and pressed his temples with his forefingers, saying, Cherry Neverland, Cherry Neverland, Cherry Neverland. I got it. When he opened his eyes, he saw Rizzo passing through the glass door and scuttling toward the street at his usual breakneck speed. Joe used the mirror next to the elevator door. Finding himself somewhat pale, he leaned forward from the waist, dangling his head and arms toward the door, hoping to bring some color into his face. Then he combed his hair, stuck in his shirt, fiddled for a moment with his cuffs, made a few reassuring clicks with his boots on the tile floor, smiled at himself, and boarded the elevator. The minute the door opened, Joe began to feel like a small child. For the man in room 317 was clearly somebody's father. He was the age of a father, old but not really old, and he was wearing a fancy, cheap, worn-out bathrobe that looked like a long-ago Father's Day present. Mr. O'Daniel was fat, and the great sagging pouches in his face were those of a man on a diet, or one who has recently been sick. His eyes were his most commanding feature, with dark-colored sacs below them and heavy brows above. They were the faded blue of an old sea captain, half blind from questioning the horizon. Standing there in his bathrobe with lips slightly parted and looking at Joe with these searching eyes, he might even have been a survivor of a shipwreck who has not yet heard the fate of his children. Are they alive? His eyes demanded. Are you one of them? Joe acted as if he were trying to answer some such question when he said, How do you do, sir? My name is Joe Buck. Mr. O'Daniel nodded. He repeated Joe's name and nodded again. His eyes said, This is an ungodly hour to get home, but thank God you're alive. Aloud, he said, Joe Buck. Joe felt he was being appraised and tried to squeeze a lot of worth into his face. They tell me you're a cowboy. Is that the truth? No, sir. Joe surprised himself by telling the truth. Then somehow inspired to show a touch of humor, he added, I'm no cowboy, but I'm a first-class fucker. This didn't earn the response he'd hoped for. Mr. O'Daniel was plainly shocked. Son, his voice was firm. There's no reason to use that kind of talk. Come on in here. Joe felt at once the dreariness of the room and noticed the understood what Mr. O'Daniel was getting at, but it seemed important, especially in view of that first blunder, to appear intelligent and agreeable. You're, Mr. O'Daniel was still appraising him. You're a little different than a lot of the boys come to me. With most of them, they seem to be, well, troubled, confused, whereas I'd say you knew exactly what you wanted. The man's voice had some old-fashioned element in it, a riverboat orator's elongated vowels, a medicine man's persuasion, but mostly he sounded like a plain person from Chillicothe, or some such place. You bet I do, sir. Well, I'll bet you got one thing in common with them other boys. I'll bet you're lonesome. Mr. O'Daniel seemed almost angry now. Am I right? You're lonesome, aren't you? Well, Joe stalled for time. He wasn't certain what was expected of him. Not to, you know a little. There, I knew it, didn't I? That's always the excuse. I'm lonesome. He mimicked a whining person. I'm lonesome, so I'm a drunk. I'm lonesome, so I'm a drug fiend. I'm lonesome, so I'm a thief, a fornicator, a whoremonger. Poop, I say poop. I've heard it all, and it always boils down to lonesome. I was lonesome. Well, I'm sick of it, sick to death. Suddenly Joe felt he had a grasp of the situation. The man was no doubt a whopper of a pimp, as Rizzo had promised, but he was also a little bit crazy. Joe wished he had been forewarned. Now the Beatitudes is very clear, said Mr. O'Daniel, looking at the ceiling and beginning to recite. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn. I wonder, Joe thought, if maybe he wouldn't appreciate if I said a little something to bring his mind back to business. Poor old fella. Blessed are they which persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. There, said Mr. O'Daniel, proceeding like a man who was already proved his point and can now afford magnanimity. Did you hear anything in there about the lonesome? Even one word? Oh, you heard about the poor in spirit, the meek, the merciful, and you heard about them that do hunger after righteousness. Sure you did, but he leaned forward on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, fingers woven together in a tense snarl of thick X's, eyes aflame with confusion, looking at Joe. You didn't hear a purr, not a purr, about the lonesome. And you know why? 'Cause there's no beatitude for the lonesome. The book doesn't say they are blessed. Not once. Mr. O'Daniel seemed to have worked himself up into another anger. Lonesomeness is something you take. You take it. Do you hear me, damn it? I say you take it. You take it. He sat straight up and knocked himself with both arms like a person taken with a sudden chill. The news had arrived, the word on those children in the shipwreck, all drowned. They go do this, and they go do that, and they go do the other thing, and they live the life of Herlihy, and they whatnot, and they follow every little whim, and they think it's fine, 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 no, just fine, because they was lonesome. It's not fine at all. His voice was suddenly tired. The oration was over. Rising from the bed, he began to pace the room, speaking quickly and quietly. Read Matthew 5. It's all in Matthew 5. 6 won't hurt you either. Read Matthew 6. Now let's get down to business. A cowboy, huh? Happy to return to the matter at hand, Joe said. Yes, sir, I'm a cowboy. Well, we need cowboys. We need everybody we can get. Mr. O'Daniel looked him over again, and then nodded. A nice-looking fellow like you. Young, strong, presentable. There's no end to what you can do in this work. Joe was relieved and grateful to be accepted. He burst into a smile and began to relax in the presence of this crazy, fatherly, important person. impressed by this expression, repeated it over and over again. He looked at Joe as if he had discovered a major poet. There, you see, that's another part of your power, your strength. You put things in very earthly terms an ordinary man can understand. Son, I'm warning you. I'm gonna use you. I'm gonna run you ragged. Are you ready for hard, hard work? Joe made a fist and drove it into the air. Then he threw his hands up in a gesture that meant, what more can I tell you? Now, Mr. O'Daniel was smiling too. You're a wonderful boy, he said, and I think you and me's gonna have us some fun, damn it. It don't have to be joyless. You know, not at all. Now, he put his hands up like a politician waiting for attention. Then, speaking almost in a whisper, he said, why don't we get right down on our knees? How does that strike you? There followed a moment in which no word was spoken, no motion was made, no breath was taken. Joe knew now what he had begun to know at the moment the door of the room had been opened to him. The knowledge had been like something sickly green trickling slowly, irrevocably into his bloodstream, too deadly to acknowledge, and now, even though he knew, and knew for certain, it was still too soon to act as if he knew. Therefore, after this long moment, he said, get down where? His lips were dry, his voice small and puny. Mr. O'Daniel said, right here. Why not? This is a church, isn't it? Every square inch of this earth of ours is a church. I've prayed in saloons. I've prayed in the streets. I'm not ashamed to pray anywhere. You want to know something? What, sir? I've prayed on the toilet. He don't care where. What he wants is that prayer. Joe nodded, and not knowing what else to do, he decided to get down on his knees and pray a while, but he couldn't concentrate on it. He reviewed in his mind the swindle that had taken place. It didn't seem believable to him, so he went through it all again and a third time. Then he heard Mr. O'Daniel's words about getting Jesus into his heart, and suddenly the reality of what had happened got through to him. He rose without a word and ran from the room, determined to right the situation. He didn't even look back when Mr. O'Daniel called down the hallway after him. Boy, boy, don't be frightened, boy. He didn't wait for the elevator either, but ran down the stairs, 2 at a time, and out onto 42nd Street, all the way over to 6th Avenue, and back again to 8th, knowing even as he searched that the odds against finding Rizzo were overwhelming. Even as he was trying to remember the name of Rizzo's hotel, he knew it was useless to do so. Joe didn't want his $20 back, not anymore. What he wanted now was some kind of revenge that would make him feel less like a fool. Standing on Times Square, looking up Broadway toward Duffy Square, he had this fantasy. A grotesque little form wheels around the corner and slips into the doorway of a cigar store. Joe runs across the street and traps him there. Rizzo has no contrition whatever. Instead, he sneers at the man he has bilked. Joe takes out a knife and holds it up to Rizzo's throat, intending to perform a neat, fatal slitting operation. But even in fantasy, he cannot get the knife to penetrate the boy's skin. He drops the knife and chokes Rizzo to death with his bare hands. The murder draws a crowd. The police come. And at this point, the fantasy ended. Joe saw a photograph of himself on the front page of a newspaper. He stopped and blinked his eyes and looked at it again. He wasn't imagining the newspaper. It was as real as his own boots, and there was the news dealer with his little green shed and the stacks of newspapers. On the front page of one of the tabloids was a photograph of a young man being led away between two policemen. Joe thought, it can't be me. I didn't kill nobody. But there was the photograph. He bought a copy of the newspaper and hurried into the pizza place with it. Examining the photograph in this light, he discovered that the young man, while close enough to himself in appearance to pass as a double, was in actuality someone else, a West Virginia mass murderer who had done in 11 members of his own family with a shotgun in a falling out over a harmonica. Joe was considerably shaken by this experience of seeing his own likeness led away by the police in such an official-looking document as a newspaper. He left the restaurant in search of a mirror and found one on the front of the place. Didn't kill nobody, he said to it. Not gonna kill nobody. He shook his head gravely at the image in the mirror, and then he walked away from it, hearing the clicking of his own heels, a distant sound now, and one without much meaning to him. A few minutes later, in his room, he looked into another mirror, and one over the bureau, and he studied his face as if he had just now met himself for the first time. Not the kind of person who kills people, he thought, but in his eyes there was a question being asked. He saw the question, but he thought, no sir, not even rats. Not even Ratso. That's what them fags called him, Ratso. Ratso Rizzo. To hell with Ratso Rizzo. That night he fell asleep with all the lights on. The next morning, Joe experienced several awakenings from sleep, putting off the final one until afternoon. Even then, he lay for a while in an imitation of sleep, unable to fool himself into thinking it was real. But that day, and for the next several days, he did enjoy a kind of somnambulism. Walked and talked and performed all the ordinary creature functions, scratching, eating, going to the bathroom, etc., without actually using his head much at all. He knew his money was running out at a rate that made the matter urgent, but he did not truly feel the urgency at all, not even at the end of the following week, when he received from the manager of the hotel a special note on the subject of his bill. In bed at night he dreamed of every form of peril imaginable. He was a passenger in cars gone berserk, an object of monstrous pursuits, a dweller in high dangerous places, an exhausted swimmer in endless oceans, but in his waking hours he went about in this numb state, insulated from his own situation by layers and layers of unrelated thoughts and fantasies and tiny preoccupations. He wandered endlessly in and out of the side streets of Broadway, his head tilted toward the little transistor radio he held at his shoulder, feeling himself contained in some fragile safety by his participation in the unseen worlds of broadcasting. He liked talk stations best, and he often entered into the conversation. Are you telling me, he one day heard, asked by a person of indeterminate gender and a very full news, that everything was simply falling off? Everything. No, 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 answered a petulant, pompous old man. Everything was not falling off everything. That would have been an earthquake syndrome. I'm talking about poltergeist. Poltergeist. Joe said, speaking through the applause. But don't go away, Granny. I want you to answer me something else. I heard a rumor about you, and I was wondering if it's any truth to it. Can you really take it standing up, Bunny? Is that so? Well, I'd say that was pretty doggone good for a great-grandma. Yes, sir, goddamn Bob. And so on. One day at Riker's, a glob of ketchup spilled onto his beige leather jacket and left an ugly stain. Joe set about developing certain ways of standing and walking that would conceal this flaw in his grooming. Then he conceived a notion of getting some more ketchup and painting what would appear to be a deliberate design over the stain. He got as far as stealing some ketchup and taking it into the men's room of the cafeteria, but he was unable to decide upon a pattern. This indecision consumed the better part of an afternoon. It was typical of the kind of paralysis into which his mind had fallen. One evening early in September, something happened that jarred him into a keen state of alarm. He came back to his hotel and found he had been locked out of his room. "Oh, we kept your things all nice and safe for you in the basement," said the clerk, in answer to Joe's inquiry about his black and white horse-side suitcase. "And when you pay your bill, we hand them right over to you." Joe tried to bargain with the man, even offered him all of his belongings if he could just keep the suitcase itself and the packet of letters Sally had written him in the army. "Oh no," the man told him. "We keep it all. Yes, we keep the whole thing. That's the way we do." Now Joe had the worrisome problem of finding a place to sleep, but that wasn't the worst of it. They had kept his horse-hide suitcase. He went into the subway arcade under Times Square, where there were many mirrors on the vending machines. He had to look into his own face to discover whether or not the new turn of events was actual or imagined. One glance told him what he needed to know. "All right, cowboy," he said to the dazed young man in the glass. "Enough of this shit. You know what you gotta do." He nodded at himself. "But do I got to? Want your suitcase?" He nodded again.